Hello and welcome. This week, we have another episode of Tabletop Thoughts, and I've chosen to dedicate this ramble to something that I've seen happen one too many times to players. Option paralysis. Or, in some circles, decision paralysis. First, let's go into a simple definition so we're all aware of what we're looking at. On the most basic level, option paralysis is the inability to choose between two or more possibilities, resulting in someone choosing the unintended option of doing nothing. Think of it as walking into an ice cream parlor, seeing 31 flavors, and finding yourself so unable to decide that you don't even walk out with vanilla. You just walk out. This is something that can happen when you're running a tabletop campaign, particularly with newer players or ones that aren't familiar with the rules that you're playing with. And as anyone that's had to deal with it can attest, it can slow a game to a crawl or have all manner of unintended consequences. You might design an encounter based on the assumption the entire party will be making at least some use of their abilities, only to have the cleric so crippled by choice that he never does anything more than make standard attacks. So then, how do we, as the people running the game or just as fellow players trying to work with the rest of the table, help the choice paralyzed? Well, for that, we're going to look into some psychology tricks and see how to adapt them to the time-honored practice of tabletop role-playing. One way to solve this is to start small. In a tabletop context, this means placing constraints and limitations on the options available, especially for beginners. Let them get a feel for how the basic abilities work before letting them dive into the fancy stuff. A well-designed system will do this for you a lot of the time by providing constraints in the early game. But if you have a more open or narrative-driven system, you'll have to create those limits yourself. Implementing a house rule about point limits at character creation, for instance. By limiting early options, you can slowly introduce more as the players get more comfortable. This is one of the reasons I think every archetype or class should have a simple option, rather than relegating the fighter or combat-focused ones to that role. Some people want to start out as a wizard and cast spells, but won't have the ability to handle managing all their possible options at the start. A simple variation of the wizard works as a better introduction than suggesting they take a fighter or barbarian and pretend the abilities are spells. Another tactic I've seen used, especially in a tabletop context, is to emphasize a quick plan over a perfect plan. Perfect planning takes time and consideration, and that can lead to overthinking and the inability to just do something already. Describe the situation as something that would be better suited to doing something now to address an immediate concern, because you can always deal with the consequences afterwards. By getting players into the habit of thinking quick, you get them to stop overthinking their abilities. Sometimes this might backfire and they fall back on the same option over and over again, but that's what the other tactics are for. One technique I've seen used for tabletop in getting players to consider other options, or just to think about what they can do, is to demonstrate. Have an NPC or an enemy use tactics or abilities that the player's character would be able to in a manner that is visible and understandable. Don't make it too complicated and try to lean more on being direct in the use. This helps show the player what that option can be used for, which can help get them started on thinking about using it next time. This can go hand in hand with the idea of making a repeatedly used option less effective in a given instance, to force them to consider a different idea. Sometimes, the option paralysis comes from a fear of failure. There's nothing I can do that would work. This kind of thinking is hard to shake, especially if the dice aren't cooperating. The demonstration method above can help with this, but sometimes you need to take more drastic measures. In these cases, you might consider using the option of hiding your rolls behind a screen or other methods so you can lie about the dice rolls. Use the fake results to boost the confidence of the player who needs it, though I'd avoid doing this too much. I prefer using it at critical moments, when not only the player but the whole party needs a boost. Another thing to remember you can do is to remind the player that while actions do have consequences, in-game choices are just small things. They're not going to affect anything outside the game, so the players can relax a little and maybe learn to laugh things off a few months down the line. Since the decisions are small, you can present it as something that isn't worth agonizing over because there won't be any big consequences for them outside of the game. If they're deeply invested in the game, this can be problematic, but enforcing the divide between in-game impact and out-of-game impact can help make things easier for many. There are other strategies, of course. But most of them rely on the person in question understanding the issue and making an effort to change. These are things that you, as GM, cannot force. The best people in our position can do is provide a little nudge along the way. With that, this week's episode comes to a close. Remember to comment if you have something to say, or maybe just click like. But it would be preferable for you to check the description and click on one of the links there. Buying my books would be a huge help, and if you'd like a sample of what my writing is like first, you can also find my short story blog linked there. See you next week.